not right. What is required for fertility decline is mortality decline. Many people, you're having John Cleland here in a few weeks' time, many people, John and I, but many others, believe that the ultimate cause of fertility decline is mortality decline. No human population has reduced its fertility from high to low levels in the absence of previous sustained major mortality decline. So poor populations can reduce their fertility. Now, Jeroen's point is, moving to the second point about urbanization, is well taken. It is true, of course, that family planning services tend to be better provided for in urban than in rural areas of most countries, and of course that relies to other forms of services as well. However, crude rates of natural increase tend to be quite similar between the urban sector and the rural sector of most countries, because of course death rates are also lower in urban areas. So I've been looking at this with what data that are available, and the crude rates of natural increase, the difference between the birth rate and the death rate, tends to be quite similar in many countries. The only point I would make in response, or in addition to what Jeroen said, is of course we would want to improve family planning services in rural areas, in many places, and that would tend to reduce the flow of rural to urban migration, other things equal. The third point related to carbon emissions, and it seemed to me that the point that was being made is that carbon emissions result from, in simple terms, modern economic growth. Absolutely. Absolutely. The whole basis of the rise in living standards that everyone in this room has enjoyed has been dependent upon the use of fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas. If we were to take out the products of fossil fuels from this room, here and now, material products, virtually everything would disappear. The building would go, we would have no clothes, the tables, the glasses, everything would go. Modern European populations and populations elsewhere are not, they don't recognize just how dependent upon fossil fuel use we are. And if you look, for example, at Europe, in France, CO2 emissions per person, something like 6 metric tons per person, which is much lower than it would be in the Netherlands, much lower than it would be in the United Kingdom, but the difficulty is it's nuclear power. So, but looking at the world as a whole, people just don't realize how crucially important fossil fuel use, coal, oil, and natural gas, the tapping of those energies is for the material living standards that we enjoy. It's an absolutely crucial point. And to take the second point from what you said, of course, in the USA, CO2 emissions per person per year are something over 20 tons per person per year, very high level, partly because of the nature of the dispersed nature of North American society. But those effects have global effects now in terms of CO2. So we need to talk about this later, but I'm very, very warm to what you said. If you plot per capita income against per capita use of fossil fuels, you find basically that poor countries don't use fossil fuels very much. They're all under 1 ton per person per year. Okay. Oh, by the way, I would like to see a rise in per capita fossil fuel use in countries like India, because it's the only damn way that people are going to be lifted out of poverty, or at least it's needed if people are going to be lifted out of poverty. But we need to recognize that, in my view. And we often don't. We avoid it. Difficult. Women's rights and education. Absolutely. Of course. Of course. But the education of women is, girls, women, etc., is terribly important. Utterly important. Incredibly important. A lot of demographic research over the last 20 to 30 years, in fact, demographers were amongst the first people analyzing data from the so-called World Fertility Survey, surveys in developing countries of fertility, found that the level of female education tended to be just about the most important variable that determined variation in, firstly, the level of fertility within the household, and secondly, the level of child mortality within the household. So what demographers appreciated, and others, of course, also much more nowadays, is that increasing levels of education for women is a key way of facilitating child mortality decline, and fertility decline. But don't get too carried away with that, because uneducated women can reduce their fertility as well. It just takes them longer to do it. If you look at India, for example, between 1991 and 2001, the late, great Indian demographer, P.N. Murray Bhatt, alas, he died just over a year ago, but he showed that 60% of the reduction in fertility that occurred in India in the 1990s occurred amongst women with little or no education. So, of course, education is terribly important, and it does facilitate the adoption of family planning, amongst other things. But it is also possible for women with little or no education to reduce their fertility as well, given the opportunity. And that's an important point to make. The final point I would say, which wasn't actually put to me, it was made more to Michelle, but I just want to briefly acknowledge the important point that you make, and that is that population issues have become one way or another taboo, and it's kind of crazy. We should be able to talk about these things. Just why they are so difficult to talk about, I don't know. They relate to issues of difficult issues like sexual relations. They deal with the difficult issues like identity and so on. But I think we should be able to talk about these things. And in that context, I would like to reiterate a point which Michelle made, which I thought was so important, given what is so often said. And that was, he underlined the important role that the United States took in promoting the idea of family planning during the 1950s and 1960s, and to some extent subsequently as well with oscillation. But it's very, very important not to recognize that. The US actually took a lead. Some people in the US in the 1950s, it was a very valuable thing that they did. Okay, that's it.
Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me?
Speak right in the microphone.
Okay. Can you hear me like this? Yeah. On the issue of population trends, we as demographers have probably a different experience from other people. I mean, I agree with you that population growth is still high in a number of countries around the world, but what has been fascinating to see over the last 30 years is the decline in fertility almost everywhere. I mean, there are still a few rural areas in Africa where the fertility decline hasn't started yet, but there are very few. I mean, rural Uganda, rural Congo, and rural Mali, not Mali, but Niger and Chad, and that's about it. Everywhere else it has been declining. There are a number of urban places in Africa where we are almost near replacement fertility. Now, if you have talked to any demographer 30 years ago, nobody would have predicted this at all. If you look at the projections that the UN was doing in the 60s and 70s, they were all predicting 15 billion people in 2050, and now they are down to 9 or 9.2 or 9.5. And this is because fertility decline has been much faster than anybody anticipated. So this is where I'm rather optimistic. In the long term, of course, the horizon is 2050, it's not today, but I think we are moving in the right direction in terms of controlling the population of the world. Of course, there's a big momentum. I mean, those things do not happen at once, but the magnitude of the changes have been much bigger than everybody anticipated 30 years ago. About population shrinking versus increasing, yeah, my point was very